So good evening, Rotarians and all colleagues in peace. I am Jim Alderman, the chair of the District 5450 Peace Committee that sponsors the forum for discussion. We're indeed happy and excited to hear from Dr. Maynard Moore. The connection of religion and war has had a long and curious relationship. What role should religion play, or should war be left to politics alone? I don't know. We're honored to have the theologian with the extensive background of Dr. Moore. But what is not on his bio is his leadership role for the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, otherwise known as IRIS. It was after World War II when many of the scientists involved in the so-called new weaponry were dismayed and later formed a relationship with the faith community of the world to better understand the failures of religion and science to society. Maynard is the vice president of administration of IRIS, and so much more, as you read in his bio. So to move this on and to have a better understanding of the world, Maynard, I am going to stop talking and give the screen to you.
All right, thank you, Jim. Greetings, everyone. As you will see from some of the slides, I am president of the board of directors for Wesley Nexus, founded in 2009 as a broad 501c3 nonprofit entity to serve the people and congregations in the Wesleyan tradition. Our mission, we draw on the Wesleyan tradition to equip persons for the practices of faith, mission, and ministry in a culture shaped by science. Because science and faith are complementary ways of knowing, we envision a network of persons who share a common interest in the promotion of sound information on science and Christianity through an ongoing constructive dialogue on issues and ideas in this broad conversation. This being said, I speak tonight not with an official statement of the Wesley Nexus board, but as an individual invited by your host to make this presentation. This presentation is in 3 parts. After my introductory remarks for perspective comes a brief overview of the just war theory and modifications through the years. How were religious institutions involved in this development of the just war theory and practice? Part B is the social principles of the United Methodist Church. It's a brief historical perspective and evolution of the social principles, followed by my current perspective on war and peace in the world community. And part C is the immediate option for organizations, the 1 billion for peace pledge. And here we have concluding remarks from the founder of the Bio-Earth community, Dr. Flannery. So let us begin. War has a mental and social reality since the first clan of primates descended from the treetops and walked out of the forest onto the savanna. Subsequently, one or another of these clans encountered other such clans who were establishing occupancy in a territory that had food to sustain themselves. And in the conflict that followed, the victors collectively felt a new sense of exhilaration. And enjoying the spoils of victory, they gained a sense of confidence that they might do this again. This exhilaration was intoxicating. And much later, when these primates had evolved into Homo erectus, they began to imagine that there must be some external power favoring their success. From that point on, God has been at war. There's no going back. It's like the invention of the wheel. Once the wheel was created, there was no going back. The evolving human brain made the easy jump from imagination to belief. And neuroscience makes it abundantly clear that belief brings to us neurochemical benefits and is the cement of positive socialization. Humans then easily make the transition from belief to the conviction that their belief corresponds to reality. Their collective feeling of camaraderie cements their identity and becomes the frame for a sense of destiny, setting us apart from all others we encounter. Early on, it was a seed embedded deep in our psyche that makes compelling author and late war correspondent Chris Hedges' declaration, his observation: war is the force that gives us meaning. Psychologists, anthropologists, social sciences of all stripes have confirmed this in many ways. It is reflected in current day comments from some returning veterans from new deployments and why so many can't wait to sign up for the next assignment. It is demonstrated in our young people who easily spend up to 6 hours a day at their computers playing Grand Theft Auto, Minecraft, Counter-Strike, and the latest version of Fortnite. When interviewed, these teens are asked why they do this, and the universal answer comes back: it's fun. Admitting that playing war games precludes them spending time in social interactions with family and friends, they explain that the action presents a clearly defined world of good guys and bad guys, with sudden and unpredictable dangers that they must successfully navigate and control. With skill and some luck, the good guys win. But if not, well, there's always another game tomorrow. Further conversation in these interviews reveal that some of these veterans and young men, and it's mostly always men, insist that they don't see the enemy as persons, but as objects to be destroyed. When asked if it would make any difference if personal images might replace the abstract objects, they confess that it would not. The famous military adage, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes," has no cogency here. Instead, typically there is the comment, quote, "I want to see blood," unquote. Discounting the vicarious violence, the teen's gratification comes when all ambiguity, all the rules at school and the niceties of family and civic responsibilities disappear. The patina of propriety is removed. War carries great risk, but risk is more easily accommodated by the brain than is ambiguity, even when danger is imminent. War presents a social order of chaos and suspenseful danger in which there are only enemies and friends, and only by skill and close attention to the unexpected can they survive another day. To understand this, we must remember that the human brain evolved to act first, then think, which is why the Army recruit is taught to follow orders, not to second-guess commands. For the teens on the PlayStation, while playing the game, they can act on their base instincts, unchecked by civility, and be rewarded for their cunning. It is what neuroscience sometimes calls, quote, neurophysiological cocktail. It is simply intoxicating. In the year between my divinity degree at seminary and my master's degree at SMU in Dallas, I spent months on the mission field in Bolivia under the auspices of the Methodist Board of Missions in New York. It was a momentous time, a period when Fidel and Che Guevara had come out of the mountains and replaced the Batista government in Cuba, giving rise to a phenomenon later labeled as Fidelissimo that was having repercussions in countries elsewhere in South America. But during that period, in the University Library in La Paz, where I was stationed, there was a complete set in English of Ernest Hemingway's novels, and I read them all. In particular, I reference here the novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, and recently I read it again. Hemingway's protagonist, Robert Jordan, is lured into joining the international cadre fighting the fascist regime in the Spanish Civil War. He says, at first, it was like taking part in a crusade. Later, he recalls this romantic enthusiasm for warfare became, quote, as difficult and embarrassing to speak about as it is to speak about religious experience, unquote. He points out that much of the allure embedded in warfare is when one is being immersed in a total experience. He says, quote, it gives you a part in something that you can believe in totally and completely, unquote. It provides a view of the world without compromise, and it makes you a band of brothers that becomes a new community of meaning. Interviews with some, not all, U.S. veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan reveal thinking that almost exactly mirrors the words in Hemingway's fictional story. One of these vets recently interviewed said that he never felt more alive than when he was in war. Other veterans, of course, have to valiantly fight off depression upon their return, but others connect their commitments to flag and brotherhood to a divine calling. On a broader scale, those on the home front, and especially those with political decision-making authority, easily make such connections by way of justifying the entire military conflict. Interestingly, the same rationale is articulated by those we label as terrorists, including those who at best can be called secular Muslims, such as those who bombed the World Trade Center from the basement in 1993, and those who organized the flights that brought down the Twin Towers in 2001. Mark Juergensmeyer, professor of sociology and global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has studied international conflicts across the planet for 40 years, has interviewed some of these freedom fighters, some while in prison and some on the ground in Al-Anbar province in Iraq. When asked about their motives, the immediate reply is always, quote, this is war, unquote. It is self-explanatory. Each of their actions is integral to the whole as a specific battle in the wider cultural and religious conflict. They see American secular culture and military presence overseas as the manifestation of war which needs no further explanation. They reflect a broader social consensus that the American-led coalition is more than just an occupying presence. They are confronting enemy troops in a cosmic war. I was speaking last year with a colleague, Dr. Tinu Ruparel, who is professor of religious studies at Calgary University. And from the time of his dissertation, his focus of study has been the violence embedded in the Hindu tradition in India. The classic Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, consists of warlike insights about human existence. The Mahabharata has existed in the form that most people in India know it today for about 2 millennia. The other classic epic, the Ramayana, dates back about the same period, perhaps even further. These great stories of Krishna and Rama, the two main avatars of the god Vishnu, are the mainstay of Hindu religiosity. Television series based on either epic have been the most popular shows ever viewed in India. When the first of these aired, all traffic and commerce ceased during the hour when it was televised. Both of these epics are about warfare, often grandly portrayed in accompanying poster art featuring the most gory of battles, vivid colors showing arrows filling the air, blood spurting from dying bodies, severed limbs strewn on the ground. The god heroes, of course, are spotless, being carried in golden chariots through the fray. In the battles of the Mahabharata, the combatants are divided between the good guys and the bad guys. Yet the struggle is not just between good and evil, but the mythic scenes carrying the theme of us versus them, the known versus the unknown. In both the Judean Christian Bible and the Ramayana, the enemies are usually foreigners from the shady edges of civilization, like Canaan and Philistia and Lanka in the Ramayana. The foes embody the murkiness of their origins and represent what is chaotic and uncertain in the world, often beyond categorization. Just as in the video games, they are abstractions. The war is portrayed not just as personal danger, but as an imminent and existential threat to civilized life, which, if not defeated, will wipe out our personal identity and all meaning. So war begins with a feeling, the anxiety that something is terribly wrong with the way things are in the wider world, overcoming personal danger. It is the experience of a social anomaly that has the potential for total destruction on both individual and social levels. Think of the epic Star Wars movies. Whole planets are at risk, and with them, a way of life. Right here with our War on Terror, the actors in the drama are convinced that the world is falling apart. And this reaches the depths of selfhood as well as the political order. It is at these moments that war seems a sensible option, because within this scenario of chaos and anomie, the idea of war seems a simple solution and actually becomes comfortable. It even brings a sense of mental relief. Moreover, it allows individuals and their comrades in battle to carry out horrendous actions that otherwise would be considered despicable. Further, when the enemy is objectified, depersonalized, it becomes impossible to morally distinguish between combatants and the larger population, who seemingly have no part in the dispute. It is largely this factor, this concern for those who are on the edges of battle, that the theory of just war arose in the West. So let's turn to our leading question. Just how and why did the notion of just war emerge and take shape in the Western world? To answer this question briefly is an oversimplification, but the time allowed for this webinar forces us to be satisfied with summary statements. Although both Plato and Aristotle made comments about the problem of violence in social relationships, to consider the role of religion in the Western world, we can begin with the New Testament. It is possible, by careful study of the context, date, and authorship of the 27 New Testament documents, to form some consensus about the emerging moral traditions in the early church, including the influence of Greek thought within the New Testament texts. Of course, such study also reveals that the early Christian writers depended heavily upon Hebrew texts, which are integral to the evolving story. Throughout the story and from the very beginning, there is moral tension in the decision-making on all of the major issues we face in human life. That's what war is all about, resolving that tension. And perhaps an overarching theme in all of the biblical stories is the tension between universalism and group identity. Hebrew scripture, of course, is deeply grounded in the notion of chosenness of the nation Israel. But Israel is chosen as both a symbol and as a catalyst of enlightenment for all the nations, meaning the rest of humankind. For its part, the Christian church inherited this notion. After all, for the first century, the Christians were mostly Jews, and notions that developed into triumphalism and later imperialism embed the idea that God is Lord of all peoples, and the reason for the existence of the church is universal in scope. The church readily endorsed the vision of the Hebrew prophets Isaiah and Micah, affirming God's intention for peace to reign upon the earth. When all is said and done, after all, quote, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. That is the universal intention and end goal. It can be argued that the earliest Christians were pacifists. No Christian was known to be serving in the imperial armies of Rome for the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. The earliest testimony we have is from the pagan historian Celsus in 190 CE, criticizing Christians broadly for being unwilling to serve in the imperial armies against the so-called barbarians threatening Rome. This ethical tension became acute when the Emperor Constantine co-opted the church and transformed the church into an instrument of the state. The watershed event is marked by Constantine's nighttime vision of the Christian cross on the flag standard of his army at the Milvian Bridge in the year 312 CE, which he interpreted as a blessing of his successful attempt to crush the last contender for the throne and unify the empire east and west. Then in 325 CE, with the Council of Nicaea, when all the bishops voted to affirm the unity of God and Christ, Constantine bestowed on the bishops legislative and governing power in all the major cities of the empire. Christian philosophers had to confront this new reality, not without hesitation. The first, perhaps, was Lactantius, who died in 330 CE. Lactantius was the tutor to Constantine's son. In his principal writing, The Divine Institutes, Lactantius identifies Constantine as the first ruler, quote, to acknowledge and honor the majesty of the one and only true God, unquote. For Lactantius, God is the parent of all humanity, and justice prevails when all mankind flourishes, when all are bonded in a single moral community. One can see the early seeds of imperialism emerging here. Other Christian thinkers over the course of the 4th century further developed these ideas. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, Bishop Ambrose of Milan, all laid down principles of ethics that are to be manifest for all humanity, so that justice, quote, creates unity across society, In Bishop Ambrose's words, quote, "Justice is so high that all else must fall beneath its authority," unquote. Ambrose, in particular, was the first to explicitly eschew pacifism, though he approves of violence only when necessary in defense of others. Then we come to the moral vision of St. Augustine. His influence arguably is without parallel in the history of Christian thought. Augustine's vision of justice is expressed in his most mature form in the magnum opus, The City of God, dated usually at 420 CE. After the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE, Bishop Augustine was challenged to demonstrate that this catastrophe was not the result of the rise of Christianity. So he outlined two cities, the one corrupted by injustice, depravity, and self-indulgence is destined to fall, that is Rome. The other is the city of God, which flourishes when people are committed to a common good, when all have sustenance and shelter, and have access to all things necessary for personal happiness. For all this, Augustine was the first Western thinker to articulate a doctrine of just war, or what he called justified war. Though without a systematic treatment of the subject, he did leave scattered comments in his writings on the basis of which later generations would expand the idea extensively. His first principle was simple. War is a moral exception in social governance. And quote, "a good ruler will wage war only if it is justified in defense of an aggressor," unquote. Of course, this leaves open the question of how we identify a good ruler and what tactics are employed in the matter of defense. Secondly, a just war can only be undertaken by a legitimate authority. Again, the question is open as to what might qualify as legitimate. And third, a very important principle, the conduct of such a war must be characterized by mercy and restraint when dealing with combatants and later with the vanquished. Next, we come to Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274. Without elaborating on Thomas' systematic theory of virtue ethics, Thomas, like Augustine before him, considered war to be an occasional necessary evil. Reaffirming Augustine's three basic principles, Thomas adds a specific condition of intent, saying, quote, "those who wage war justly aim at peace," unquote, a goal that must be clearly defined as the intended end. An additional condition, which in Thomas manuscripts comes in through the back door, is a passage elsewhere dealing with the matter of killing another in self-defense. The act of slaying the aggressor is a last resort, only if other means are not available or appropriate for one's defense. Skipping ahead, let's take a quick look at Martin Luther, who died in 1546. Once he posted his 95 Theses for debate on the church door of the cathedral in Wittenberg, Luther was caught up in a groundswell of controversy and discussions concerning the moral behavior of the believing Christian. In his treatise, published in 1520 as Concerning Christian Liberty, Luther says, quote, "We give this rule: the good things which we have from God ought to flow from one to another and become common to all, so that every one of us may, as it were, put on his neighbor and so behave towards him as if he himself were in his place," unquote. In modern parlance, this means that those grounded in the love of God will, by necessity, become part of a loving, generous community. Recognizing this circumstance, Luther advocated that secular rulers be strong not only in matters of personal self-defense, but committed to the defense of their exposed and vulnerable subjects. This became known as Luther's, quote, strange work of love, unquote, because it often would involve physical force, perhaps even killing. Luther sought to apply this principle in the so-called Peasants' War of 1524-25. But the social causes of the rebellion seemed totally beyond his comprehension. He valiantly tried to offer clarifications of his little treatise, but the brutality and suffering caused by the unrestrained forces of the duchy never mitigated the controversies that ensued between secular and religious authorities. This local war, in fact, demonstrated the weakness of the just war theory, and those religious and secular authorities throughout the period can be criticized equally for the atrocities that Christians carried out against the Jewish communities throughout the European continent. Restraint was absent. Let me move on quickly now to John Wesley, who died in 1791. Over his long life, more than 60 years of which were devoted to his leadership of the fledgling Methodist movement, Wesley made substantial contributions to both theological and practical social questions that emerged during the period now called the English Evangelical Revival. Though he never produced a definitive systematic summary of his thought, in his letters and journals, which comprise 26 volumes in small print, several of his theological convictions are pertinent to our concerns here. Important, John Wesley was very aware of the destruction and suffering experienced by the general population during the English Civil Wars of 1639 to 1651, sometimes called the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, but more generally the Great Rebellion. It was set off by the execution of King Charles I in January 1649 and ended with the restoration of the House of Stuart in September 1651. But as the royalist troops and the rebellious forces under Oliver Cromwell were uncompromising in their actions, even 100 years later, during Wesley's lifetime, memories of the atrocities were vivid. Wesley was by no means a political theorist, and most of his writings, his focus was on the high ideals of individual ethics. But recognizing that poverty resulting from the burgeoning Industrial Revolution had the potential of fracturing the social order, he wrote extensively in an attempt to analyze the vast economic forces gripping the British working class. This being said, we do not have from Wesley's pen an exposition of a just war theory, but his ethical analysis of the roots of war, economic injustice, and exploitation of human and natural resources served well for Methodists in future generations. That is where all this leads me, exemplified by the founding of the Methodist Federation for Social Action in the U.S. in 1904. Originally known as the Methodist Federation for Social Service, the Methodist Federation for Social Action, known as MFSA, was founded in 1907 by several Methodist Episcopal clergy and lay leaders to direct church attention to the enormous human suffering among the working class. Immediately, the Federation became Methodism's unofficial rallying point for the social gospel, as articulated by author Walter Rauschenbusch. Scribbled on a Western Union notepad, this first social creed was submitted and passed without dissent on May 30th, 1908, by the General Conference of the Methodist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Over the next 4 decades, MFSA established itself as a force within Methodism. In 1979, the Federation issued a documented study of the presence of the so-called new far right in the denomination and rallied forces to stem its influence. MFSA was the leading force in the struggle for support of disinvestment from apartheid South Africa, especially by the Board of Pensions. The current priorities of the Federation include working on issues of peace, poverty, racial justice, women's rights, and other progressive initiatives. In the area of peace, MFSA sponsors nonviolence training and action seminars and promotes a just and lasting settlement to the conflict in the Middle East. In April of 2007, the Federation celebrated its 100th anniversary in Washington, D.C. In 2017, MFSA made a commitment to focus special energy on dismantling racism within church and society and launched its new justice-seeking congregation program. In June of 2018, MFSA moved its national office to downtown Detroit, Michigan, and hired Bridget Cabrera as its new executive director. In May 2024, adopted by the General Conference of the United Methodist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, here is what the United Methodist Church offers on the matters of war and peace. And I will just quote selected passages, not read the whole thing. Here's what the social principles say. The church deplores war and all other forms of violent conflict and urges the peaceful settlement for all disputes. We yearn for the day when there will be no more war and people will live together in peace and justice. We reject the use of war as an instrument of foreign policy and insist that every peaceful and diplomatic means of resolution be exhausted before the start of armed conflict. Similarly, we oppose the increasing reliance on preemptive strikes unless they can be clearly demonstrated to be proportionate in response, delimited in human casualties, and undertaken in response to clear and immediate threats to human lives. We grieve that in a world where so many live in poverty, governments continue to dedicate enormous resources to preparing for and conducting wars. We are especially distressed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons and call not only for an end to their production, but for their complete elimination. Continuing now, we urge all United Methodists to examine their own consciences and earnestly seek God's guidance when it comes to matters of military service. We also honor and support the witness of pacifists whose consciences and religious convictions prevent them from serving in the military or limit them to taking non-combatant roles. The roots of such pacifist convictions are well established in the historic stances of the United Methodist Church and its predecessor bodies. As a church, we commit ourselves to support all people as they discern how best to model the nonviolent example of Jesus. The church supports and guides those who serve in the military, those who are conscientious objectors, veterans living with physical, psychological, spiritual, and moral injury, and families of people affected by military service. We urge the church to care for and work for systemic justice for all people affected by war, and to advocate for peacemaking and nonviolent conflict transformation in global and local conflicts. End of statement. Now, I offer this witness not simply because I am Methodist, but to urge any of you who are members of congregations and other denominations in Roman Catholic parishes, in independent churches, to research, review, and discuss your own statements on war and peace. And to conclude this litany, let me offer my current perspective on war and peace in the world community. In the first place, Christian theologians in the first 4 centuries generally accepted the moral legitimacy of the state, sword and all. But few, if any, of these apologists accepted the notion of war as routine, or as a neutral activity. Coercion, not to mention killing, is bound to be problematic for a social ethic grounded in the life and teaching of Jesus and in God's love for all the earth. At the same time, a disavowal of all forms of coercion almost certainly leaves the most vulnerable members of society hostage to the most self-serving elites and the inclination of those who wield power. The reality is that in the tension between love and power, it seems to most that the power inevitably wins. That is so whether the question is raised within the immediate social community, the nation state, or at the level of international politics. This inevitably raises the question of the extent to which Christians can endorse the exercise of state power. This has been a troubling problem from the beginning, even in the mission of Jesus. It is a massive dilemma. The dilemma resides in the fact that the entire planet is now carved up between nation states who claim sovereignty over land and the people who reside within their borders. There must be some consensus about what constitutes the legitimacy of the state. Christian ethics will have few adherents without some principled support for the state, since it is the only entity that claims jurisdiction over the wider society acting as a whole. But it is easy to see, even now, in some sections of the globe, the state has disintegrated into warring, self-interested groups, each with modern armaments as they seek to gain uncontested control. Christians are part of this global society and some level of responsibility everywhere for the maintenance of peace and social order. Can historic, religious, and social conflicts be resolved peacefully? Perhaps not. Tension between questions of morality seem perennial. Love is and should remain the foundation of Christian ethics. But justice, as the institutional structure of compassion, inevitably is dependent upon other incentives, including ultimately the use of force to restrain those who would do harm. The just war theory is now obsolete. With the advent of modern weapons, there is no way to protect civilian populations in modern war. The creative resolution of political, religious, and social tensions must rely on active peace building, creating consensus around institutions focused on community well-being where force is seldom necessary. This commitment rejects the sterile alternatives of sectarian elitism and uncritical support for authoritarian, hierarchical forms of government. Since 2012, the U.S. Department of Defense has named the climate crisis as the #1 danger to world peace and the security of the United States. This DoD report is sobering. The research is thorough and conclusions indisputable. The DoD is mandated to update this analysis periodically and did so in 2017 and again in 2021. The DoD report outlines climate change as a threat not just to the most vulnerable of peoples, but is already triggering massive migrations and untold numbers of refugees. However, this is perhaps the one issue on which various and diverse nation states have the potential to come together to work for peace. Here is the point. All of the issues that threaten peace across the globe are now magnified by the climate crisis, which will render our planet uninhabitable in a few decades. It is a wicked crisis and cannot be solved by one nation alone. The perennial task before us is the building of a civil society in which people can dwell together without fear and can work for common ends disclosed in public dialogue. The challenge in this third millennium is to do that on a global scale. How can democratic messiness survive in a world with such diverse cultures, religious commitments, and economic interests? Can institutions be crafted or evolved that will effectively make war obsolete at long last? Perhaps the answer lies in our willingness to seek new partners, organizations with an international scope and principles, exhibiting the best of moral insights, including secular, non-sectarian commitments that transcend narrow personal identities. Dare I say, institutions like Rotary International? The questions that Rotarians always seem to ask in discussions like this is, what can we do? It seems that Rotary International has already begun to affirm the mission of several other institutions that share common goals and promise to become such partners for peace. To conclude, I have with me tonight one such partner, which I believe has the potential for building that common good. I want to present to you Dr. Frances Flannery. She's an academic living in Harrisonburg, Virginia, an interdisciplinary scholar, an innovative researcher with many publications, including Apocalyptic Violence and Socio-Political Imaginaries, Understanding Apocalyptic Terrorism, Countering the Radical Mindset, the Bible in Political Debate, Biblical Wisdom Then and Now. Most importantly, she is co-founder of BioEarth, an international 501c3 nonprofit that fosters societal and ecological resiliency in the face of the worldwide climate crisis, with active projects from Washington State to the Democratic Republic of Congo. As part of BioEarth's 1 Billion for Peace Pledge tour, introduced in summer 2022, Dr. Flannery was invited to lecture on peace studies throughout the USA and around the world, including in Dublin, Ireland, Trinity College, the Irish School of Ecumenics, and St. Patrick's Cathedral, the University of Lisbon in Portugal, and notably visited the DMZ between North and South Korea as part of the 2023 Korea Global Forum for Peace Education in Seoul. In short, Fran is 100% committed to peace building. So please give your attention to her words tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really touched by that introduction. I'm so grateful to Rotary International, and I'm so grateful to my friend Maynard for this invitation. I'm aware of the time, and I don't want to go on too long, but I do have something that I want to share with you because I am very concerned about the state of the world, and I'm worried that we are closer to World War III than we've been in my lifetime. Yeah, and so on that point, let me go ahead and share some things. I'd be happy to share my slides as well afterwards. Um, so I am an interdisciplinary thinker, as Maynard said, and so I take a systems point of view. And I'd like to begin by quoting a couple of things from the great systems analyst and thinker, Donella Meadows. And pardon me, something's happening to my picture here as I try to move this off there. Sorry. She has made the claim, which I find very convincing, that people who have managed to intervene in systems, and this is any kind of systems, and so I'm applying it to the kinds of systems that are embroiled in war today, at the level of paradigm, have hit a leverage point that totally transformed the systems. So in other words, my question is, how do we change a system if we're feeling that wars are so violent now that just war theory cannot be supported anymore? How do we change that system? And a paradigm is the shared idea that a society holds. It's often something that is not even stated. It's the blind assumptions that we just have about the world, right? And so she's essentially saying that one of the most effective ways to change a system is to change the underlying paradigm. And interestingly, she says to change a paradigm, whether it's a scientific paradigm, whether it's a social paradigm, or in this case, the systems of this military industrial complex that perpetuates war, she says there's nothing physical or expensive or even slow about paradigm change because it can happen in a millisecond with a single individual if you have a new way of seeing, a click of the mind, she calls it. She lists a few ways that we can change paradigms, and I think it's worth mentioning. You point out the anomalies and the failures in the old paradigm, which I think is exactly what Maynard has just done, that it doesn't apply anymore. And you keep speaking and acting from the new one, which I'm going to share in a moment. You insert people with the new paradigm into places of public visibility and power, and don't waste time with reactionaries. You work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. And it's that middle ground of active change agents that made me so happy to be meeting with Rotary International tonight. And so I want to attempt to lay bare this paradigm of peace that's used in the war machinery that we see being perpetuated in the Middle East right now, in Ukraine and Russia right now, and in a whole bunch of other settings as well. And I think it goes something like this. It's a securitized definition of peace. Maynard spoke to it. I'm going to give it a different spin, but it's essentially the same thing. A nation has legitimate self-interests, and therefore it has a right to act in its self-interest, including defending itself militarily in the presence of violence against persons or property. And then we've slid in the last few decades into saying, even if this means acting preemptively, and that's what the Methodist Church was responding against. So my question, which I don't have time to go into in depth, but I just ask it rhetorically, has this approach actually worked to end the cycle of violence in the modern contemporary era? You know, in war against state violence, has this approach and this definition of securitized peace stop war? Obviously not. In counterterrorism or countering violent extremism, even against non-state asymmetrical violence, has it stopped it when we have interpreted terrorism as a problem of killing terrorists or to be solved by killing terrorists rather than to address the grievances behind an ideology? No, it has not. That's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of 16 intelligence agencies who concluded that preemptive strikes in Iraq, for instance, after 9/11, is what gave more fuel to Al-Qaeda and increased the conditions that created ISIS. I want to ask whether this definition in this period of our shared climate future works. Can it work to mitigate the common threat of climate change when climate change knows no borders? So it's predicated on the concept that just war is fought by legitimate parties, and that's a nation. But when we're dealing with climate change, which is the greatest threat to the globe that we've ever encountered in human history, and it's not to the planet, it's to human civilization, right? The planet will survive, but human civilization may not. Does it work anymore? And so I hope you're familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the gold standard of climate science. But they issue reports periodically that are the best that we've got, condensing tens of thousands of scientific studies. They recently in 2023 changed the previous goal, which was to avoid the worst catastrophic effects of climate change. And now it is quite simply to secure a livable future for humanity. In order to do that, they say we must cut global carbon emissions in half in 5 years to meet the goal of net zero global carbon emissions by 2050. That's only 25 years from now, and then reach net negative carbon emissions afterwards. And so, for the first time in human history, human civilization has to make these kinds of cooperative changes in order to survive and have a habitable planet, as Maynard was saying. So, the team that I am a part of, BioEarth, which is a nonprofit that's been in place since 2019, the best lever for change that we have been able to come up with the available evidence is a new paradigm to change the system. And it is the 1 billion for peace pledge. It's very short, and here it is. It's the whole pledge. This is the organizational pledge. There's also individual pledges that are just the same. Sustainable peace entails the physical, the material, the psychological, the cultural/religious, and ecological well-being of all peoples. That's the whole peace pledge. And then the organizational one adds, we declare our organizational intention to pursue sustainable peace in our work and in our lives. It is embedding the idea that peace is more than the absence of war. It's not just the physical and the material. It's a dynamic system of universal needs and ecological needs. And it takes the reality that we're all in one global climate system seriously. So the old paradigm, which runs diplomacy, it runs the climate talks right now, it runs debates about how to handle conflict and war between nations, is negotiated national self-interest. It's not going to work in this new system. That will doom us. War will prevent us from reaching decarbonization necessary to secure a livable future, and we need unprecedented global cooperation. And so, BioEarth, and I'm recognizing the time, so I'm going to shorten this. Now, after introducing this in 2022, has 1.2 million signatories to the pledge, and it's growing on 6 continents. The idea is diverse individuals and organizations across civil society, unified around this goal of sustainable peace, is a powerful lever to influence the change makers. If it is nonpartisan, interdisciplinary, cross-sector, international, and interfaith, and PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the U.S., just adopted the Peace Pledge as their official motto for governing their climate change. They adopted that with their General Assembly. And so it can be a network for broad-based education on climate, on peace building, and it's been shared around the world, as Maynard already mentioned, in conflict-affected zones and climate-affected zones. I won't go into this example to give you time, but we recently put this into action and had proof of concept because we were able to discover an existential threat that would have been a climate tipping point. You can look at bioearth.org to read about it, but we were able to bring together some of the signatories who amplified the facts that we collected and reached elite levels of visibility and power, one of Danilo Meadows' levers for change. And 2 weeks later, a crisis was averted. The crisis was that they were auctioning the Congo River Basin to oil developers, which is something you probably did not know about because even Jane Goodall didn't know about it. And so for that reason, I'm excited to say that I think that this could be effective. We invite you to sign and join this global, growing, sustainable peace movement with this new paradigm. And it's this peace pledge that I've already shared. And here's the bottom line. With the time that we have left to make meaningful change to avert an uninhabitable world in the coming decades, not in centuries from now, but before the end of the century, the task is too large and the time is too short for any organization, or any individual to secure a livable future, but we can do it together. So our motto for the Peace Pledge is local plus local plus local is global. Local organizations all around the world. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. What I heard tonight was a phenomenal call to action by all of us tonight. On this call, we have many, many Rotary International peace activists and more. Of course, peace was the very first area of focus. We now have 7 areas of focus, and 4 years ago, Rotary International added the environment as an area of focus because it is so essential. There are those that say without the environment, nothing else matters. But again, we need to to create peace in order to work together because, as we know, military is by far the worst environmental polluter there is many times over. So let's get rid of war. It took the Methodist Church about 2,000 years, but they have come to the philosophy that I certainly believe in. There are alternatives to war. So we need to teach those alternatives, show that there's other ways of getting on. Dr. Francis Flannery, Dr. Moore, we are so thankful for your information. And I would, if anybody is interested in Dr. Flannery, if you would share your PowerPoint, I would be happy to share that with any of the people that request. So we thank you. And I'm going to ask Dr. Moore for his talk because I want to reread that. It was very good. Thank you so much. So we are thankful. So next month, we're very eager to hear from Catherine Hughes Freitag. Her extensive travels makes it a challenge to find time for her to share her expertise. She's a national and international activist and educator working on rights and justice in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, immigrant rights, women's rights, racial justice, and indigenous rights. You'll soon have her extensive background in her email, and we're very happy to have her because she's constantly traveling the world trying to change it and fix it. So we're looking forward to Catherine Hughes Freitag for next week. Again, Dr. Flannery, Dr. Moore, we are so grateful and we thank you so immensely.